Darius, I think it's best we go our separate ways. Sign the divorce papers.
I've had enough of this. How many's the meaning of this? Do you understand the gravity of what you're about to do?
She handed me the divorce papers the night before I signed the biggest deal of my life. What she didn't know was that her timing would cost her everything she thought she'd secured. There is a kind of silence that doesn't feel like quiet. It feels like pressure, like the air itself has decided to hold its breath, and everything around you goes still in a way that makes your skin prickle in your chest, tighten before you even understand why. I know that silence. I lived inside it for years. But the night Vanessa Cole slid those papers across our kitchen island, the marble cold beneath my fingertips, the silence that followed wasn't the kind I was used to. It wasn't the silence of a marriage running low on words. It was the silence of a man whose entire world just shifted on its axis, and who hadn't yet decided whether to scream or simply stand there and let it happen. My name is Darius Cole. I am 43 years old. I was born in the West End neighborhood of Atlanta, Georgia, in a house where the AC unit rattled so loud in the summer that my mother used to say, God was trying to drown out our arguments. I grew up with less than nothing, which is different from having nothing, because having nothing at least has a floor. Less than nothing means you're already underground before you start digging. My father, Raymond Cole, worked 3 jobs when he could get them and when he couldn't. He worked 2 and prayed the third would come. My mother, Gloria, cleaned offices downtown 6 days a week and still found time to press my school shirts on Sunday evenings with a care that felt almost ceremonial. They were not wealthy people, but they were relentless people. And somewhere along the way, relentlessness got into my blood and became the only inheritance that ever truly paid out. I started my first business at 19 years old. Nothing glamorous. A landscaping operation out of the back of a borrowed pickup truck, serving the Buckhead. Neighborhoods where the lawns looked like they'd been trimmed with nail scissors and the sprinkler systems cost more than my parents' annual income. I did that for 3 years, saved every dollar I didn't absolutely need to survive, learned how money moved in those neighborhoods, how the people who had it talked about it, where they put it, what they feared losing. I wasn't trying to become one of them. I was trying to understand the terrain. And then at 22, I pivoted. I took everything I'd saved and I enrolled in a coding boot camp, taught myself software architecture in 6 months, and built my first app, a logistics management tool for small, Black-owned businesses that were being crushed by the overhead costs of inventory tracking. I called it ClearPath. It wasn't perfect, but it worked. And more importantly, it solved a real problem for real people who looked like me, and that meant something that no amount of money could fully translate. By the time I was 28, ClearPath had grown into a full technology firm, Cole Digital Systems. We had 40 employees, offices in Atlanta and Charlotte, and contracts with 3 of the top 20 logistics companies in the Southeast. I was not yet rich by the standards of the world I was beginning to move through, but I was standing at a door I had built myself, and I knew, with the kind of bone-deep certainty that doesn't require external validation, that I was about to walk through it. That was also the year I met Vanessa. She walked into a charity gala. I'd been invited to one of those events where the tickets cost $3,000, and the cause is always something distant, enough to feel noble without requiring personal sacrifice. I almost didn't go. My assistant, a sharp young woman named Priya, had put it on my calendar 6 weeks in advance, and I'd been looking for a reason to cancel ever since. But Priya had a way of reminding me about opportunities without ever calling them that. And so I put on my navy suit and I went. And there was Vanessa Harris, in a floor-length copper gown, standing near the bar with a glass of sparkling water, talking to no one, looking like she owned the silence around her. She was beautiful in a way that didn't announce itself. It crept up on you. High cheekbones, deep brown skin, natural hair pinned up with one coil escaping near her left ear. She had a stillness about her that I mistook in those early months for depth. I learned later that stillness can also be strategy. But in that room, in that moment, I was drawn to her the way you're drawn to something that seems like it might finally make sense, of a life that has moved too fast to fully feel. We dated for 8 months. We were engaged for 14. We were married on a Saturday in June in Savannah, Georgia, under Spanish moss and white lights, with 250 and 12 people who loved us, or loved the idea of us, raising their glasses as the sun went down over the river. My mother cried 3 times. My father shook my hand at the altar and held it a second longer than necessary, and I understood everything he was trying to say without a single word passing between us. The first 3 years of the marriage were good. Not perfect, but good in the ways that matter. We built a home in Cascade Heights. We argued about furniture and vacation destinations and whose family we'd spend Thanksgiving with. We laughed at private jokes. We made plans. We were 2 people trying to construct something lasting in a world that doesn't always cooperate with lasting things. I was still building cold digital systems. Vanessa worked as a senior brand strategist at one of Atlanta's most respected marketing firms, and she was exceptional at her job. Brilliant, actually. She had an instinct for narrative, for knowing what a company needed to say about itself, to make people lean in rather than look away. I admired that about her. I told her so often. But somewhere around year 4, something shifted. I couldn't have named it then. I can name it now. It was the money, not the presence of it, the scale of it. Cold Digital Systems had landed a federal contract, a significant one. The kind that doesn't just change your revenue numbers, but changes your category. Suddenly, I wasn't a successful Atlanta entrepreneur. I was something else. Something that made people look at me differently when I walked into rooms. That made invitations arrive that hadn't arrived before. That made Vanessa start spending weekends in ways that didn't always include me. She said it was networking. She said her career was expanding. And maybe it was. I wanted to believe it was. I focused on the company because the company was the one thing I could trust to behave according to the effort I put into it. By the time I was 41, Cold Digital Systems had a valuation of $800 million. We had offices in 6 cities. We employed over 400 people, 60% of whom were black, which was not an accident. It was a mission. Every hiring decision, every vendor contract, every partnership, I ran them through the same filter. Who benefits? Who gets brought up? Because I had not forgotten the West End. I had not forgotten the borrowed pickup truck. I had not forgotten my mother pressing my shirts on Sunday evening like it was the most important thing she would do that week. Because to her it was. And then the call came from Marcus Whitfield. Marcus Whitfield was the chairman of Whitfield Garrett Ventures, a private equity conglomerate based in New York with holdings across 4 continents. He was 61 years old, 3rd-generation wealth, Harvard-educated, and one of the most respected black business figures in the country. He had been watching Cold Digital Systems for 2 years. His team had done their due diligence. They wanted in. Not a minority stake, not a board seat. A full strategic acquisition. Cold Digital Systems merged with Whitfield Garrett's technology division to form a combined entity that would be valued at signing at $2 billion. I would retain 40% equity and executive oversight. I would remain the face and the force of the operation. And I would receive, at the moment of closing, a personal liquidity payout that would make everything my parents had ever sacrificed feel like it had compounded with interest across generations. The deal had taken 14 months to structure. 14 months of negotiations, of legal reviews, of due diligence, meetings that stretched past midnight, and conference calls that started before sunrise. My lead attorney, a man named Gerald Okafor, who I had trusted since my company's earliest days, had overseen every line of every document. My financial advisor, Renata Simmons, had modeled every scenario. We were ready. The signing was scheduled for Tuesday morning, 10 o'clock, at the offices of Whitfield Garrett's Atlanta legal team. It was a Monday night when I walked through the front door of my house in Cascade Heights, loosened my tie, set my keys on the kitchen counter, and found Vanessa standing there in the overhead, light with a manila envelope, in her hands and an expression on her face that I had never seen before. Not anger, not sadness, something colder than both. She set the envelope on the island between us and said, "I need you to sign these tonight." I looked at the envelope. I looked at her. I said, "What is this?" And she said, "Divorce papers. I want out, Darius. I've had them prepared for 3 months. My attorney says the longer we wait, the more complicated it gets." 3 months. She had been carrying this for 3 months and had chosen tonight, the night before the most consequential morning of my professional life, to place it in front of me. I want you to understand what that timing meant. I want you to sit with it, because it was not accidental. Nothing about Vanessa Harris was ever accidental. She had built a career on knowing exactly when and how to deliver a message for maximum impact. She understood framing. She understood the moment. And she had chosen this moment with the same precision she applied to everything else. I didn't sign the papers that night. I picked up the envelope, looked at her for a long time in the silence of our kitchen, and then I walked upstairs to our bedroom, sat on the edge of our bed, and spent the next 4 hours doing the only thing I knew how to do when the ground moved beneath me, I thought. I breathed. I remembered who I was before she walked into that gala in the copper gown. I called Gerald Okafor at 11:15 at night, and I said, "Gerald, I need to tell you something before tomorrow morning." And Gerald, who had been through enough with me to know that nothing I said was ever without a reason, said, "Talk to me." I told him about the papers. I told him about the timing, and Gerald was quiet for a moment. And then he said 7 words that I will carry with me for the rest of my life. He said, "Darius, do not sign anything tonight." I didn't. The next morning, I put on my best suit, the charcoal one, the one my mother had helped me pick out for my first real investor meeting years ago. I ate breakfast alone at the kitchen table. Vanessa was still in the house. I could hear her moving somewhere upstairs, and the sound of her presence, familiar and now fractured, sat in the air around me like smoke. I didn't go upstairs. I picked up my briefcase, walked out the front door, and drove myself to the offices of Whitfield Garrett's Atlanta legal team. And at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday morning, I sat across the table from Marcus Whitfield and signed my name to a $2 billion deal. The pen felt heavier than it should have, not because I doubted the decision, but because I was signing it as a man whose life had cracked open the night before and who was holding himself together by the same relentlessness that had always been the only inheritance worth having. I shook Marcus Whitfield's hand. I shook Gerald's hand. I accepted congratulations from people whose names I would remember later, when the noise in my head quieted enough to let other sounds in. And then I walked to my car, sat in the driver's seat, and let myself feel it for exactly 4 minutes, all of it. The magnitude of what I had just built and what I was about to lose. The grief and the triumph, sitting side by side in my chest, like 2 things that had never been meant to coexist but had decided to anyway. 4 minutes. And then I started the car, because there was work to do, and because falling apart has never once built anything worth having. What I did not know in that car on that morning was what was coming next. I did not know what Vanessa's attorney had already set in motion. I did not know what she believed she was entitled to, and on what basis she believed it. I did not know that in pursuing what she thought was her advantage, she had already made the mistake that would unravel everything she thought she had secured. I did not know any of that yet, but I was about to find out, and so was she. There is something uniquely disorienting about returning to a house that no longer feels like a home. The furniture is the same. The smell is the same, that particular combination of cedar and the vanilla candles Vanessa preferred, and the faint trace of the coffee I made every morning in the kitchen. The photographs are still on the walls. The throw blankets are still folded over the arms of the couches with the kind of careful arrangement that suggests someone wanted the space to look lived in and curated. At the same time, everything is exactly where it has always been. And yet the moment you cross the threshold knowing what you now know, knowing what has been said and what has been handed, across a cold marble island in an envelope that took 3 months to prepare, the house stops being a place you belong to and becomes a place you are simply occupying while the next chapter of your life assembles itself around you. I came home from the signing that Tuesday afternoon, and Vanessa was in the living room. She was sitting with her legs folded beneath her on the cream sectional, her laptop open on the cushion beside her, her reading glasses on, looking for all the world like a woman in the middle of an ordinary workday. She looked up when I walked in, and something passed across her face that I couldn't immediately categorize. It wasn't guilt. Vanessa Harris did not do guilt in any form I had ever been able to recognize. It was closer to assessment. She was reading me the way she always had, the way she read every room she walked into, scanning for information, for leverage, for the narrative beneath the surface. "How'd it go?" she asked. The question landed with a kind of audacity that almost made me respect it. Almost, because to ask that question in that voice with that casual tilt of her head after what she had done the night before that required a specific kind of nerve that most people don't possess. Vanessa had always possessed it. It was part of what had drawn me to her in the beginning. The confidence, the composure under pressure. I had just never imagined that one day I would be the pressure she was composing herself against. It went well, I said, and I set my briefcase down and walked upstairs. That was the last real conversation we had for 11 days. Not because I refused to speak to her. I am not a man who punishes with silence. It is not in my nature, and it would not have served me in any case. But there was simply nothing. To say that wouldn't have been better said through the attorneys. And Gerald had already made that clear. He called me that same afternoon, while I was still sitting in my car in the garage, and he said, "Listen to me carefully. Do not discuss the deal with her. Do not discuss the company's financial position with her. Do not volunteer anything. Her attorney is going to try to build a picture, and every word you say in that house is a brushstroke." I listened. I always listened to Gerald. That habit had saved me more than once. What I learned in those 11 days, from Gerald, from Renata, from the quiet and thorough investigation that Gerald had quietly commissioned before I even thought to ask for it, was that Vanessa's filing was not impulsive. It had been constructed with intention, and with patience, and with a very specific financial theory at its center. Her attorney was a woman named Celestine Park, one of the most aggressive divorce litigators in Atlanta. Celestine Park did not take cases she didn't believe she could win, and she did not build arguments on sentiment. She built them on numbers. And the number she had built Vanessa's case around was the valuation of Cold Digital Systems at the time of the marriage versus its valuation at the time of the divorce filing. And the delta between those two numbers, which was enormous, which she intended to argue, represented marital assets subject to equitable distribution under Georgia law. Let me explain what that means in plain terms. Because the law has a way of dressing very simple ambitions in very complicated language. When Vanessa and I married, Cold Digital Systems was worth approximately $40 million. When she filed for divorce, it was worth $800 million. Celestine Park's argument was that the growth of the company during the years of the marriage, the $760 million increase in value, had been achieved in part through contributions Vanessa had made, directly or indirectly, to the business and to the marriage that had sustained and supported the business. She would argue that Vanessa's career had provided financial stability during early lean years. She would argue that Vanessa's social connections and networking had opened doors for Cold Digital. She would argue that Vanessa's presence as a spouse had freed me to focus on the company, without the burden of building a personal life alone. And she would use all of that to claim a share of the company's growth that, at the numbers she was targeting, would represent somewhere between $250 and $300 million. She had not yet learned about the Whitfield-Garrett deal. That was the first thing Gerald told me when he laid out the full picture. Celestine Park had filed on the basis of an $800 million valuation. She did not know because the deal had not been publicly announced, because the NDA that governed the negotiation period was ironclad, because the signing had happened that very morning that Cold Digital Systems was no longer an $800 million company. It was now, as of 10 o'clock that Tuesday morning, a component of a $2 billion combined entity. And my personal liquidity payout from that deal, the lump sum I would receive at closing, was a number that would change the entire battlefield. Celestine Park thought she had mapped. Gerald let that sit in the air between us for a moment, and then he said, with the measured calm of a man who had spent 30 years turning crises into advantages, "The question isn't what she's claiming, Darius. The question is what she's entitled to. And the answer to that second question depends entirely on when the value was created and how." I sat with that. I turned it over. And then I said, "When do we start?" The response to Celestine Park's filing was prepared over the course of 3 weeks. Gerald brought in 2 additional attorneys, a forensic financial specialist named Dr. Anthony Burrell, who had testified in over 60 high-stakes divorce cases and whose reputation for dismantling inflated asset claims was legendary in Georgia legal circles, and a corporate law specialist named Yvette Chambers, who had written academic papers on the question of business, valuation in divorce proceedings, and who had an ability to explain complex financial structures to a courtroom in language. That was both precise and devastating. Together, the three of them built a response that was not defensive. It was offensive. Because Gerald had identified something in those 3 weeks of quiet investigation that Celestine Park had not anticipated. Vanessa's side would find a pattern. It started with the financial records. Renata Simmons had been Cole, Digital's financial advisor since the company's 3rd year, and she maintained records with the kind of meticulous care that comes from understanding that in business, documentation is not administrative, it is protective. When Gerald's team went through those records with Dr. Burrell, what they found was a series of transfers, small at first, amounts that individually wouldn't raise any flags, $3,000 here, $5,000 there, transactions that looked, if you glanced at them, like ordinary household expenses or personal purchases. But Dr. Burrell did not glance. He calculated, he traced. He followed every transfer through every account, and what emerged from that tracing was not a picture of ordinary household spending. It was a picture of systematic, long-term financial extraction. Over the course of 4 years, Vanessa had moved approximately $1.2 million out of joint accounts and into accounts that Gerald's investigators had to work to find because they had been opened quietly, carefully, under arrangements designed not to be visible to a spouse who was, by his own admission, spending most of his time and attention building a company. $1.2 million, moved in increments over 4 years, with the patience and precision of someone who had been planning an exit long before she placed that envelope on the kitchen island. I want you to understand what it feels like to receive that information. Not the anger. The anger comes, and it is clean and clarifying, and I will not pretend otherwise. But before the anger, there is something else. There is the moment of recalculation. That happens when you realize that a significant portion of your life has been operating on false premises, that the person sleeping beside you was running a parallel ledger, that the woman who had stood under the Spanish moss in Savannah in June and made promises in front of 212 people had been, at some point between that ceremony and this kitchen island, already composing her exit while you were composing your future. That recalculation is not quick. It does not happen in a single moment. It happens in layers, over days, each layer revealing something underneath it that requires its own processing. I processed. I let Gerald work. I went to the office every morning and I ran the company with the same discipline I had always brought to it, because 460 people depended on Cole, Digital's operational stability, and not one of them had signed up to absorb the collateral damage of my personal life. That was a boundary I set for myself in the first week, and I held it with everything I had. The announcement of the Whitfield-Garrett merger came 12 days after the signing. It was structured as a press release, coordinated between the communications teams of both companies, and it landed in the business press with the impact that Marcus Whitfield's team had anticipated. Front page of the Atlanta Business Chronicle. Feature coverage in Forbes, Black Enterprise, and the Wall Street Journal. My photograph, the one taken outside the Cole Digital offices on Peachtree, in the charcoal suit my mother had helped me choose, ran alongside headlines that described the deal in terms that still feel slightly unreal to me even now. $2 billion merger, landmark deal, one of the largest acquisitions in the history of Black-owned American technology companies. I was told by someone whose discretion I trust completely that Vanessa saw the coverage at 7:14 in the morning, sitting at the kitchen table of the apartment she had moved into 6 days earlier, with a cup of coffee going cold in her hand. I was told that she read the headline twice, and then she called Celestine Park. That phone call must have been a difficult one, because what the announcement revealed, what Celestine Park now had to grapple with as she sat across from a valuation argument she had spent months constructing, was that the number she had built her entire case around was no longer the relevant number. The company had not been sold in a transaction that liquidated its value. It had been merged in a structure that was specifically, deliberately, and legally designed in a way that had significant implications for how marital assets could be calculated, claimed, and pursued. Gerald and Yvette Chambers had spent 14 months helping to structure that deal. Some of those months had overlapped with the months Vanessa spent preparing her filing. The difference was that Gerald had known about Vanessa's preparations for longer than she had known he knew, and he had structured accordingly. I am not going to tell you that what Gerald did was simple. Corporate law and family law operate in different jurisdictions and according to different principles, and the intersection between them is a complicated and genuinely contested space where brilliant people disagree. But what I will tell you is that the structure of the Whitfield-Garrett deal, the specific terms of my retained equity, the specific timing of my liquidity payout, the specific legal categorization of the new combined entity versus the old cold digital systems had been arranged with a care that Dr. Burrell would later describe in a deposition as architecturally precise. Celestine Park was a formidable attorney, but she had been handed a blueprint that had already accounted for her, and that was before Gerald introduced the financial extraction evidence. Celestine Park received the documentation of the $1.2 million in transfers. On a Thursday morning, Gerald sent it through the proper legal channels, accompanied by a letter that was 3 paragraphs long and written in the kind of language that manages to be completely professional and completely devastating at the same time. He did not moralize. He did not editorialize. He simply presented the documented evidence and noted its relevance to the question of equitable distribution, to the question of marital waste, and to the question of what the court might find instructive when evaluating the claim that Vanessa Cole had made essential and uncompensated contributions to the marriage and to the business. I learned about Celestine Park's response secondhand, through the kind of professional network that exists between attorneys who have faced each other in court enough times to develop a complicated mutual respect. What I was told was that she was quiet for a long time after she read the letter, and then she asked her assistant to clear her afternoon. Vanessa called me that night. Not through the attorneys, directly on my cell phone, a number she still had because neither of us had changed it. It was the first time she had called me since she moved out. I looked at her name on the screen for 3 rings and then I answered. She said, "Darius." I said, "Vanessa." And then there was a silence. And in that silence I could hear something I had never heard from her before. Not anger, not strategy, not the careful composure she wore like a second skin. What I heard was the sound of someone who has realized for the first time that the move they made was not the move they thought it was, that the board they were playing on was not the board they had mapped, that somewhere in the construction of their exit, they had missed something fundamental, and that the missing of it was going to cost them in ways they were only beginning to calculate. She said, "I didn't know about the deal." I said, "I know." She said, "The timing." And I said, "I know, Vanessa." Another silence. And then she said quietly, in a voice stripped of everything except the truth of the moment, "What happens now?" And I said, "That depends entirely on what you decide to do next." I did not say it with cruelty. I want to be clear about that. I have known cruelty, the particular cruelty of a world that looks at a black man from West End Atlanta and decides before he opens his mouth what category he belongs to. I do not carry that cruelty forward. It is not who my mother raised me to be, and it is not who I have chosen to remain. But I also did not soften it, because the truth does not require softening to be delivered with dignity, and Vanessa had made her choices with open eyes, and the consequences of those choices were hers to face with the same composure she had applied to everything else. She said she needed time to think. I told her to take it, and I hung up and sat in the quiet of my home office and looked at the photograph on my desk, the one of my parents at my wedding, my father in the suit he'd bought for the occasion, my mother in the blue dress she'd spent 3 weeks deciding on, and I thought about what they had built, in a house with a rattling AC unit in the West End, with 3 jobs and 2 jobs and a prayer for the 3rd. And I thought about what I had built on top of that foundation, layer by layer, year by year, with relentlessness as my only inheritance. And I thought, nobody takes this from me. Nobody. There is a particular kind of clarity that arrives only after devastation. Not during it. During devastation, you are simply surviving, moving from one breath to the next with the mechanical focus of a man who has learned that falling apart is a luxury that the relentless cannot afford. But after it, when the immediate crisis has settled into something more manageable, when the legal machinery is turning in the right direction and the emotional shock has metabolized into something harder and more useful. In that space, clarity arrives, and it arrives with a precision that ordinary life rarely produces. Because ordinary life allows you to be distracted. Crisis does not. Crisis strips everything down to what is real and what is not, to who is present and who is performing presence, to what was built on solid ground, and what was built on the assumption that you would never look too closely at the foundation. I looked closely. In those weeks following Vanessa's phone call, while Gerald and Celestine Park began the careful, grinding process of negotiation that precedes either a settlement or a courtroom, I looked at everything, not from anger. Anger had come and gone in the first days, clean and clarifying, and I had let it move through me without acting from inside it, because I had learned long ago that decisions made in anger are decisions made with one eye closed. I looked from the position of a man who needed to understand what had actually happened, not just what had been done to him, but what he had allowed, what he had missed, what his own attention and his own absences had made possible. I had not been a perfect husband. I want to say that plainly, because the story of a wronged man who was entirely blameless is not a true story, and I have never had patience for stories that sacrifice truth for the comfort of a clean narrative. I had been absent in ways that mattered. Not physically, I came home. I was not a man who disappeared into other women or other cities or other lives, while my wife waited at the kitchen table. But I had been present in the way that a building is present, structurally there. Load-bearing, reliable in the most fundamental sense, but not warm in the way a home requires warmth. My mind had lived in the company for years. My best energy, my most creative thinking, my deepest engagement, those had gone to cold digital. And Vanessa had received what remained after the company took its share. I understood that. I held it. And then I set it alongside everything else. I had learned the 3 months of preparation, the carefully moved funds, the timing chosen with the precision of a strategist. And I asked myself the honest question that clarity demands. Was this a woman driven to an exit by a husband who had stopped showing up? Or was this a woman who had decided on her exit long before she had a reason that any reasonable person would recognize, and who had simply been waiting for the optimal moment to execute it? The answer, when I looked at it without flinching, was both. And the both of it was the hardest thing to carry, because it meant the marriage had been failing in ways that were real and in ways that I shared responsibility for. And it also meant that the response to that failing had been neither honesty nor conversation nor the kind of direct reckoning that two adults who had once loved each other might have chosen. It had been calculation, quiet, patient, financially sophisticated calculation. And that distinction between a marriage that ends because two people have grown apart and a marriage that ends because one person decided to monetize the growing apart, that distinction matters, not for the purpose of assigning permanent blame, but for the purpose of understanding what you are actually dealing with. And understanding what you are dealing with is always the first requirement of dealing with it correctly. Gerald called me on a Wednesday morning with news that changed the temperature of the entire proceeding. He had been in communication with Celestine Park's office for 11 days, the kind of careful, professionally courteous, back and forth that accomplished litigators use to take each other's measure before the real conversation begins. And the real conversation had now begun. Celestine Park had revised her position significantly. The original claim, the $250 to $300 million demand built on the $800 million valuation, had been quietly walked back. What Celestine Park was now putting on the table was a settlement figure that Gerald described as considerably more grounded in legal reality. It was still a substantial number, but it was a number that reflected the actual legal landscape rather than the landscape Vanessa had imagined she was walking into when she handed me that envelope. The revision had been driven by 3 things. First, Dr. Burrell's forensic analysis of the Whitfield Garrett deal structure had established, with the kind of documented precision that is very difficult to argue against in a Georgia courtroom, that the value created by the merger, the delta between the $800 million valuation and the $2 billion combined entity, had been generated through corporate mechanisms that predated the marriage's deterioration, and that were legally categorized in ways that significantly limited Vanessa's claim to a share of them. Second, the evidence of the $1.2 million Dollars in transferred funds had introduced the concept of marital waste into the proceeding, which shifted the equitable distribution calculus in ways that Celestine Park had not budgeted for when she built her original case. And third, and this was the piece that Gerald mentioned almost as an aside, in the way that the most significant information is sometimes delivered, the investigation had found something else, something beyond the financial transfers. I need to tell you about Marcus Bellamy. Marcus Bellamy was 37 years old, a commercial real estate developer based in Midtown Atlanta, a man whose name I had heard once or twice in passing through mutual professional circles, but who had never registered as anything more than a name. Gerald's investigators, the same people who had traced the financial transfers through 4 years of careful accounting, had found, in the course of their work, a pattern of communication between Vanessa and Marcus Bellamy that stretched back 22 months. Text messages, some of which had been deleted but not irrecoverably so. Calendar entries, cross-referenced with Vanessa's work schedule and mine. Hotel records, 3 of them, in Atlanta, in Charlotte, in New Orleans during a weekend. Vanessa had told me she was attending a brand strategy conference. 22 months. While I was negotiating the Whitfield-Garrett deal. While I was flying between Atlanta and New York and Chicago and Los Angeles to build the thing that was going to change my family's trajectory for generations. While I was pressing my foot to the floor and pouring everything I had into a company that employed 460 people, and that carried the weight of what I had promised myself it would carry. She had been, for 22 months, conducting a parallel life with a man I had barely registered as existing. I sat with that information for a long time, a very long time. Gerald had delivered it in person, in my office, with the kind of careful gentleness that he usually reserves for news that he knows is going to require a person to reorganize themselves before they can respond to it. He set the summary document on my desk and he said, "Take whatever time you need." And then he sat across from me and waited. Because Gerald Okafor has known me long enough to understand that I do not need to be talked through things. I need to be given space to think through them myself. And I need someone in the room who is not going to fill that space with noise. I thought about the copper gown. I thought about the Spanish moss in Savannah. I thought about my father, holding my hand at the altar 1 second, longer than necessary. I thought about what I had believed I was building, and what had actually been true at the same time I was believing it. And then, and this is the part that I have turned over most carefully in the years since, looking for the feeling that should have been there, I found that the grief was not as sharp as I expected, not because I didn't feel it, but because somewhere in the preceding weeks, in the clarity that crisis produces, I had already begun to understand that what I was grieving was not the marriage that had existed, but the marriage I had believed was possible. The marriage I had worked toward with the same relentlessness I applied to everything else, not realizing that relentlessness alone cannot build something that the other person has already decided to exit. The grief was real, but it was clean. And clean grief, I have learned, is the kind you can carry without being broken by it. What the Marcus Bellamy evidence meant, legally, was significant. Georgia is not a no-fault-only state. Adultery is a recognized ground for divorce, and it carries legal weight in the equitable distribution calculation. It does not automatically eliminate a spouse's claim to marital assets, but it is a factor that a court considers, and more importantly, it is a factor that a skilled attorney uses as leverage in the settlement negotiation. Because the alternative to settlement is a public trial, and a public trial means that everything Gerald's investigators had found, the transfers, the hotel records, the 22 months of communication, becomes part of the public record. And Vanessa Harris, who had built a career on narrative and on the careful management of how stories are told, understood better than most people what it would mean for her professional reputation, her relationships, and her future if that record became public. Celestine Park scheduled a call with Gerald for the following Monday. Gerald told me afterward that it was the most substantive conversation they had yet had. Celestine Park was, as always, composed and professional, but the terms she was now discussing bore almost no resemblance to the terms she had opened with. She was no longer talking about a share of the company's growth. She was talking about a settlement figure that reflected The marital assets as they had existed in the jointly held accounts, minus the documented transfers, plus a negotiated support arrangement that Gerald described as reasonable, which, coming from Gerald, meant it was a number I could live with without it representing a victory for a claim. That was never legitimate to begin with. I told Gerald to keep negotiating, not because I wanted to reduce Vanessa to nothing. I did not. And I want to be clear about that. She had been my wife for 7 years. Whatever had happened in those years, they had been years of my life, and you do not spend years of your life with a person and walk away from the ending of it without some weight of feeling that deserves respect. But I was not going to accept a settlement that rewarded the specific conduct that had been documented, and I was not going to accept a number that had been calculated on the basis of a financial position that Celestine Park had fundamentally misunderstood. Gerald understood that. He always understood what I needed, without requiring me to use more words than the situation actually called for. In the middle of all of this, the legal negotiation, the emotional processing, the daily discipline of running a company that was now operating within the structure of a $2 billion merger and required my full and functional attention, something unexpected happened. Something that had nothing to do with attorneys or valuations or the careful reconstruction of a life that had been partially built on false premises. Something that came from a direction I was not watching. My mother called me on a Sunday afternoon in October. Not unusual. Gloria Cole called every Sunday. Had called every Sunday since I moved out of the West End. A habit she had maintained through every phase of my adult life with the consistency of someone who understood that checking in is an act of love that does not require a reason. But this Sunday was different. She said, "Darius, I need you to come by. I made food." And the way she said it, the particular weight she placed on the last 3 words, told me that the food was not the point. I drove to the house in West End, the same house with the old AC unit that had been replaced twice since my childhood, but whose memory still lived in the walls. She had made my favorite, baked chicken, sweet potatoes, cornbread, the kind of meal that communicates love in a language older than words. We ate together at the kitchen table, my father in his usual chair, my mother moving between the table and the stove with the ease of a woman in complete command of her domain. And then after we had eaten, after my father had retreated to the living room with his Sunday paper and his deliberate give us a moment exit that he had never fully acknowledged was deliberate, my mother sat down across from me and folded her hands and looked at me the way she had always looked at me when she was about to say something important. She said, "How are you really doing?" Not how is the company, not how is the deal, not how is the legal situation, which she knew about in the broad strokes because I had told her, "How are you really doing?" The question that cuts beneath the competence and the composure and the relentlessness and asks about the person underneath all of it. I told her the truth. I told her about the grief and the anger and the clarity and the strange feeling of standing at the edge of a life that was simultaneously more successful than anything he had dreamed of and more personally dismantled than anything he had prepared for. I told her about the copper gown and the Spanish moss and the feeling of signing the biggest deal of my life as a man whose marriage had cracked open the night before. I told her about Marcus Bellamy, and I watched something move through her face that was not surprise exactly, but was the confirmation of a thing she had sensed for longer than she had said. She was quiet for a while after I finished, and then she said, in the voice she uses when she is delivering something she has thought about carefully, "Baby, the hardest thing about being as strong as you are is that people confuse your strength for a surface they can stand on. They forget that underneath the strength, there's a person. Make sure the next person you let close enough to matter understands the difference." I held that. I have held it ever since. Because my mother, who pressed my shirts on Sunday evenings and cleaned offices, downtown 6 days a week, and raised a son in a house with a rattling AC unit, has always known the thing about me that I am slowest to say aloud. That relentlessness is real, and it is mine, and it is the engine of everything I have built. But it is not a substitute for being known, and being known requires a vulnerability that I had not, in 7 years of marriage, fully allowed, not because I was incapable of it, but because I had been too busy building to stop long enough to be seen, I drove home from West End that Sunday evening with something shifted inside me. Not healed. Healing is not the work of a single Sunday dinner, no matter how good the cornbread is, but shifted, the way a bone resets after it has been broken correctly. There is pain in the resetting, but there is also the beginning of something that will eventually be stronger than what existed before the break. Gerald called Monday morning. The negotiation was moving toward a number. Celestine Park had made what Gerald characterized as her final meaningful concession. The figure on the table was, given everything, the merger structure, the transfer documentation, the adultery evidence, the legal reality of Georgia equitable distribution, a figure that reflected the world, as it actually was rather than the world Vanessa had assumed she was operating in when she prepared that envelope 3 months before handing it to me. I told Gerald to close it, and then I hung up the phone and looked out the window of my office at the Atlanta skyline, at the city that had grown up around the boy from West End, and I felt not happiness exactly. Not yet, because happiness requires time and distance and the full metabolizing of everything that has happened, but something adjacent to peace. The peace of a man who has held his ground, who has not been moved from the thing he built, who has absorbed a blow that was meant to break him and has instead used the impact as information. The settlement was signed on a Thursday. It was not the number Vanessa had walked in expecting. It was not the number that would have made her the story. She had perhaps imagined she would be the woman who had been indispensable to a billionaire's rise and who had claimed her portion of that rise on the way out the door. It was a fair number, in the legal sense, accounting for what was genuinely hers from the years of the marriage and nothing more. Gerald called it equitable. I called it done. But what I did not know on that Thursday, as I signed my name one more time and felt the weight of finality settle over the proceeding, was that the closing of the legal chapter was not the end of what Vanessa's choices had set in motion. There were consequences still arriving, consequences she had not calculated because she had not known to calculate them. Consequences that were not engineered by me or by Gerald or by anyone on my side of the table, but that were simply the natural result of certain decisions, meeting certain realities in a world that keeps moving regardless of what we intend. Those consequences were just beginning to arrive, and what they would do to the life she had built outside of mine was something neither of us could have fully anticipated. There is a moment in the life of every consequence where it stops being abstract and becomes real, where it stops being a thing you understand intellectually. Yes, actions have results, yes. Choices carry weight, yes. The world responds to what we put into it, and becomes a thing you feel in your body, in your daily life, in the specific and unignorable texture of your actual circumstances. That moment arrives differently for different people. For some, it arrives quickly, like a door closing. For others, it arrives slowly, like water finding its way through stone. For Vanessa, from what I was able to piece together through the months that followed the settlement, it arrived in stages, each stage quieter than the one before it, each one requiring her to revise downward the picture she had been carrying of what her life was going to look like on the other side of that envelope. The first stage arrived before the ink on the settlement was dry. Marcus Bellamy, the man whose name had appeared in Gerald's investigative summary with the kind of documented specificity that leaves very little room for alternative interpretation, had built his commercial real estate business on relationships. That is true of most businesses in Atlanta, where the professional and the personal have always been intertwined in ways that can work magnificently in your favor when things are going well and can unravel with remarkable speed when they are not. Marcus had cultivated those relationships carefully over 15 years. He was known in the right circles. He was invited to the right events. He moved through Midtown Atlanta with the ease of a man who has made himself useful to enough people that his presence is always welcome and his phone calls are always returned. What Marcus had not fully accounted for in the 22 months of his relationship with Vanessa was the size of Atlanta's professional network among Black business leaders and the degree to which that network, while expansive, is also intimate. People know each other. People talk. Not maliciously necessarily, though Malice is not absent from any human community, but in the way that people who have built things together and struggled together and celebrated together tend to share information with a candor that they might not apply in broader, more anonymous professional settings. Marcus Whitfield, my new business partner, was 61 years old and had spent 4 decades building relationships in exactly that network. He knew people who knew Marcus Bellamy. And when the details of what had emerged during the divorce proceeding became known, not through any announcement because I made none, but through the particular osmosis by which certain information moves through certain communities, those relationships began to respond. 2 of Marcus Bellamy's 3 major development projects in Atlanta involved financing partners who were connected, in various degrees of directness, to the Whitfield-Garrett network. Not because of any action I took. I want to be absolutely precise about this, because it matters to me that you understand it. I did not make calls. I did not send messages. I did not suggest to anyone that Marcus Bellamy's professional relationships should be reviewed or reconsidered. What I did was sign a $2 billion merger that made me a significant figure in a network that was already paying close attention to who was building what and with whom and on what foundations. And when certain information about Marcus Bellamy's personal conduct became known in that network, the people in it made their own assessments and their own decisions. That is how networks work. That is how they have always worked. And Marcus, who understood networks well enough to have built a business on them, should have understood that they cut in both directions. 2 financing conversations that Marcus had been cultivating for the better. Part of a year went quiet in November, not with dramatic announcements, not with confrontations or explanations. They simply went quiet. In the way that professional relationships go quiet when the people on one end of them have decided to redirect their attention elsewhere and do not feel obligated to explain why. Marcus made calls that were not returned with the same promptness they had previously been returned. Meetings that had been tentatively scheduled became indefinitely postponed. The temperature of his professional environment dropped in the way that temperatures drop in Atlanta in November, gradually, almost imperceptibly at first and then unmistakably, until you can no longer pretend it is still the season it was. Vanessa felt this through Marcus, and she felt it in her own professional life through a separate mechanism entirely. Her position at the marketing firm had been, for years, one of the strongest in her division. She was a senior brand strategist of genuine ability. I have never disputed her talent, and I will not start now. But her position at that firm had also been supported, in ways that she may not have fully traced until they were no longer operating, by the reflection of my professional reputation. The Cole name opened rooms. The Cole name meant that when Vanessa walked into a client meeting, there was a layer of credibility that arrived before she did. Not because she needed it. She was good enough at her job to stand entirely on her own work. But it was there. And in a city where professional identity is built on layers of association and affiliation, the removal of one layer changes the architecture of what remains. The firm did not fire her. Nothing so direct. What happened was subtler and in some ways more disorienting. The senior partnership track that she had been told, in various implicit and explicit conversations, was hers to claim. It stopped being mentioned. The client accounts that carried the most prestige began, gradually, to be redistributed in ways that were explained to her as structural realignments. She was still doing her job. She was still producing good work. But the invisible machinery of professional advancement had shifted, and she was no longer moving through it in the direction she had expected to be moving. I know about this because of Priya. Priya Anand had been my assistant for 6 years, and she had long since evolved beyond the title of assistant into something closer to the operational conscience of my professional life. She knew my calendar, my priorities, my tendencies, and my blind spots with the precision of someone who has paid close attention to a person over a long period of time. She also knew Vanessa, not intimately, but in the way that the professional and the personal overlap in the life of someone who manages the daily logistics of both. And Priya had a gift which I had come to rely on for noticing things that I was too close to or too busy to see. She came into my office on a Tuesday afternoon in early December with 2 cups of coffee and a look on her face that I recognized as her preamble to telling me something. She had decided I needed to know. She set a cup in front of me and she sat across from me and she said, "I heard something I think you should be aware of. You don't have to do anything with it, but I think you should know." She told me that she had run into a woman named Diane Osei at a professional event the previous Friday. Diane Osei was a senior account director at Vanessa's firm, someone Priya had met at various professional gatherings over the years and maintained a cordial acquaintance with. Diane had told Priya, with the careful phrasing of someone who is sharing information without wanting to be characterized as gossiping, that Vanessa had been struggling since the fall, that the divorce had landed harder in the professional environment of the firm than anyone had initially expected, that there had been a client incident. Diane was not specific. That had created some distance between Vanessa and the firm's managing director, and that Vanessa had, in a moment that Diane described as uncharacteristic, broken down in the office bathroom in a way that two of her colleagues had witnessed and that had circulated through the firm with the speed that these things always circulate, through small professional communities. I sat with that information. Priya watched me sit with it, and she did not try to fill the silence, because she knows me well enough to know that silence is sometimes where I do my most important thinking. What I felt sitting with it was not satisfaction. I need you to understand that clearly, because the story of a man who is vindicated by the suffering of the person who wronged him is a story I recognize and a story I refuse to be the protagonist of. Satisfaction requires a kind of smallness that I have never been able to afford. What I felt was something more complicated and more honest than satisfaction. It was the specific sadness of watching a person with genuine talent allow that talent to be undermined by choices they made from a position of something other than their best self. Vanessa was capable of more than what she had done. She had always been capable of more. And the fact that her choices had led her to a Tuesday afternoon in a bathroom that two colleagues remembered, that was not a victory for me. It was a loss for her, and it was a waste. And it made me feel the weight of 7 years in a way that triumph never could. I told Priya thank you, and then I said, "Is there anything she needs?" Priya looked at me for a moment, with the expression of someone recalibrating their understanding of a situation. And then she said, "I don't know. I can find out if you want." I thought about it. And then I said, "No, don't. She has people. Let her people handle it." Because there is a difference between cruelty and appropriate distance, and I was not willing to cross into either direction. I was not going to engineer her difficulty, and I was not going to position myself as her rescuer. Both of those options require a level of continued emotional entanglement that I had decided, deliberately and carefully, to release. She had made her choices. The world was responding to them. That was not mine to manage. What was mine to manage was everything else. And everything else in December of that year was considerable. The integration of Cole Digital systems into the Whitfield Garrett technology division was the most complex operational undertaking I had ever led. 460 people whose roles, titles, compensation structures, and daily working realities were being restructured within a much larger organizational framework. Systems that needed to be merged, cultures that needed to be aligned, clients that needed to be reassured that the quality and character of Cole Digital's work would be preserved within the new entity. I worked 16-hour days through December and into January. I flew to New York 3 times in 6 weeks for integration planning sessions with Whitfield Garrett's leadership team. I held town halls with my staff, our staff now, where I stood at the front of the room and said, with every ounce of conviction I actually felt, that the mission of this company had not changed, that the 60% Black workforce was not a number we were going to let integration dilute, that the vendor relationships with Black-owned businesses were not negotiable, that the culture I had built from a borrowed pickup truck and a landscaping operation in Buckhead was the culture that had made this company worth $2 billion, and that I would protect it with the same ferocity I had applied to building it. Marcus Whitfield sat in the back of one of those town halls. He had flown down from New York without announcing it, which was his style. He preferred to see things as they naturally were rather than as they had been, prepared for his arrival. He came to my office afterward and he sat down and he said, "You know what the rarest thing in business is?" I said I didn't know. He said, "A leader who understands that the people are the asset, not the product, not the IP, not the valuation. The people. He paused. You understand that. I've been in this business for 40 years and I can count on one hand the number of people I've met who actually understand it rather than just saying it. I thanked him. And then I said, "Can I ask you something?" He said, "Yes." I said, "When did you know you wanted this deal?" Not the company, me specifically. "When did you know?" And Marcus Whitfield, 61 years old, third-generation wealth, Harvard-educated, one of the most respected black business figures in the country, looked at me with an expression that was partly amused and partly something more serious. And he said, "The day I read about the federal contract you turned down in year 4, I looked at him. He said, "You remember it?" I said, "I remember it." He said, "You turned down $40 million in federal revenue because the contracting structure would have required you to shift 30% of your workforce to non-black vendors. You walked away from $40 million. I said, "Not many." He said, "None. In my experience, none." And that told me everything. I needed to know about the kind of company this was and the kind of man who was running it. I had never told anyone about that decision except Gerald and Renata. I had not announced it, had not used it as a public statement, had not turned it into marketing. It had simply been a decision I made in a conference room with 2 people I trusted, based on a principle that I was not willing to compromise. And Marcus Whitfield had found out about it anyway, because people who are serious about finding things out generally do. That conversation stayed with me. It stayed with me through January and into February, through the grinding work of integration and the quieter work of personal reconstruction. Because what Marcus had identified, the decision I had made in year 4, was the same principle that had governed the hiring decisions, and the vendor relationships, and the community, investments, and the West End foundation I had quietly established 2 years earlier to provide business mentorship to young black entrepreneurs in the neighborhood where I had grown up. I had not done those things for recognition. I had done them because they were the right extension of a story that had started in a house with a rattling AC unit, and because I understood, at a level that was not intellectual but cellular, that the only version of success worth building is the one that reaches backward to the people who are standing where you once stood. In February, the West End Foundation held its first annual event. 50 young entrepreneurs, ages 18 to 30, selected through an application process that Priya had managed with her characteristic thoroughness. A full day of mentorship sessions, workshops, networking, and what I called honest conversation, not the sanitized version of success that gets served at inspirational events, but the real version with the borrowed trucks, and the lean years, and the federal contracts turned down, and the marriages that crack open the night before the biggest morning of your life. I stood at the front of that room and I told them everything. Not for sympathy, not for the narrative of triumph over adversity that people find comfortable because it has a clean arc, but because the truth of building something is more useful than the myth of it. And those 50 young people deserved useful. My father came to that event. He sat in the 3rd row in the suit he had bought for my wedding, which still fit him because Raymond Cole had always been a man of disciplined dimensions in every sense of the word. He did not say much afterward. He shook my hand, the way he had at the altar, holding it 1 second longer than necessary, and everything he had ever wanted to say about what I had become and what it meant and what it cost and what it was worth. All of it was in that 1 extra second. My mother took photographs on her phone with the focused intensity of someone documenting something that matters. I drove home that evening through the streets of Atlanta, through the West End and past the house with the replaced AC unit, and through Cascade Heights and into the life that was being rebuilt around me with the same relentlessness that had built everything before it. And I thought about what clarity had taught me in the months since the envelope. That strength without vulnerability is architecture without warmth. That the company you build is only as true as the principles you refuse to compromise. That grief is not the enemy of growth. It is sometimes the most honest path to it. And that the life you construct on the other side of devastation, if you construct it with intention and with the full weight of what you have learned, can be more solid than anything that came before it. What I did not yet know on that February evening was that the story was not finished, that there was one more turn coming, one more moment that would require me to decide. Again, who I was and what I was made of, not in a courtroom or a boardroom. In a much quieter place than either of those, where the only audience was myself, and the only verdict that mattered was the one I could live with. That moment was coming, and I was almost ready for it. There is a season that comes after the storm that most people don't talk about, because it doesn't have the drama of the storm itself, and it doesn't have the clean resolution of full recovery, and so it tends to get skipped over in the telling of things, collapsed into a transitional sentence between the crisis and the triumph. But that season is where the real work happens, not the visible work, the legal filings, and the press releases and the integration meetings and the town halls, the interior work, the slow, unglamorous, daily discipline of deciding who you are going to be now that the version of yourself that existed before has been permanently altered by everything that happened. That season arrived for me in the spring of that year, and it lasted longer than I expected, and it asked more of me than the storm had, because the storm at least told me clearly what it required. This season required me to figure that out for myself. I had moved out of the Cascade Heights house in January. Not because I was asked to. The house was mine, unambiguously, held in a legal structure that the divorce settlement had not disturbed. But I did not want to live in it anymore. Not because of the memories. Exactly. I am not a man who is destroyed by the presence of memory. And I had learned long ago that running from the places where difficult things happened is less useful than staying long, enough to change your relationship with those places. But the house had been built for a life I had been living with someone else. And the shape of it, the open-plan kitchen with the marble island, the cream sectional in the living room, the way the light came through, the back windows in the late afternoon, all of that shape had been designed around a version of my future that no longer existed. And I believed, in the way that I believe most things I act on, not from sentiment but from pragmatism, that beginning the next chapter required a physical space that had not been preloaded with the architecture of the previous one. I found an apartment in Inman Park, top floor of a building, that had been a warehouse in a previous life, with exposed brick and ceiling heights. That felt almost unreasonable, and windows that faced east so the morning light came in. Without apology, it was smaller than the house by a significant margin. I furnished it with the things I actually needed and nothing I didn't, which turned out to be less than I had, accumulated over years of living in a space, sized for impressiveness rather than comfort. I kept the photograph of my parents from my wedding. I kept the desk from my home office, a heavy oak piece that my father and I had carried up 3 flights of stairs on a Saturday morning when I first moved to Atlanta as a young man, and that had traveled with me through every iteration of my life since. I kept a painting by a young Atlanta artist named Kofi Mensah that I had bought at a gallery opening 4 years earlier because it stopped me in the middle of a crowded room and refused to let me keep walking. A large canvas in deep blues and earth tones, abstract but somehow deeply figural, the kind of work that means something different. Every time you look at it and means all of those things simultaneously, the apartment felt, from the first morning I woke up in it, like a place that was mine in a way the house had never been. Not because the house wasn't legally mine, but because every choice in it had been a negotiation, which is appropriate in a shared life, but which means that the final result is a compromise rather than an expression. The apartment was an expression, and living inside something that expressed you without apology, I discovered, is a specific kind of freedom that I had not known I was missing until I had it. I began running in the mornings, not for any organized purpose, no race I was training for, no fitness goal I had set myself against some metric. Just running out of the apartment building at 5:45 in the morning, through the streets of Inman Park, through Candler Park and Kirkwood, through the quiet that belongs to early morning. Atlanta before the city remembers. It is a city and begins its daily assertion of noise and traffic and urgency. I ran 4 miles most mornings, sometimes 5, sometimes more when I needed the additional distance between me and whatever was pressing most heavily on my mind. Running had been part of my life in earlier years, before the company consumed the hours where it used to live, and returning to it felt like reconnecting with a version of myself that had been patient enough to wait. Those morning runs became the space where I did the interior work that the season required. Not in any organized therapeutic sense, though I had also, at the suggestion of a friend I trusted, begun meeting twice a month with a therapist named Dr. Wendell Banks, a man in his mid-50s, with an office in Decatur and a manner that was simultaneously warm and rigorous, who had a gift for asking the question underneath the question I thought I was asking. The runs were different from therapy. They were less structured, more intuitive. They were the space where I let the unfinished thoughts run alongside me until they either resolved or revealed themselves as things that didn't require resolution, just acknowledgement. What I was working through in those mornings was something that my conversation with my mother had surfaced, and that Dr. Banks had helped me look at more directly. The question of what I had built my life around, and whether what I had built it around was sustainable, and what it would mean to build the next chapter around something more complete. The company was real. The mission was real. The relentlessness was real and mine, and not something I wanted to dismantle, because it was the engine of everything that mattered. But my mother had said that strength is sometimes confused for a surface people stand on, and Dr. Banks had said something that operated on the same frequency, which was, Darius, what would it cost you to need something? Not to be weak, not to abandon the discipline, but to need something, to allow that need to be visible, to build a life that had room for it. I thought about that question on many mornings, running through the quiet streets, and I did not arrive at a quick answer, because quick answers to real questions are almost always wrong. What I arrived at gradually, over weeks of mornings, was something more like a direction than an answer, a sense of the kind of life I wanted to build in this new chapter. Not just the professional architecture, which was already taking shape with the precision that professional architecture always took when I gave it my full attention, but the personal one, the one that happened in the apartment with the east-facing windows and the coffee-mensa painting, the one that would eventually include other people, when I was ready to include them from a place of genuine wholeness rather than from the residual loneliness of a marriage that had ended. I was not yet ready. I knew that, and I respected it. And I did not rush it, because rushing the interior work produces the same kind of structural failure that rushing any foundational work produces. You end up with something that looks finished before it is, and then you discover the instability at the worst possible moment. What arrived instead in that spring was friendship. Real friendship, of the kind that I had allowed to thin during the years of the marriage and the company building, when every hour was allocated and social life became a category of obligation, rather than a source of genuine nourishment. My closest friend since college, a man named Terrence Webb, who was a cardiologist at Grady Memorial, and one of the most genuinely funny human beings I had ever encountered, reappeared in my life with a persistence that I found both annoying and, when I was honest with myself, deeply needed. Terrence had known Vanessa, had always been politely cordial with her in the way that good friends are politely cordial with spouses they have reservations about, and when the divorce became known to him, he had called me once, said what needed to be said, and then said, "Are we going to have dinner, or are you going to keep being a hermit?" I had laughed. For the first time in what felt like a very long time, I had laughed the way you laugh when something catches you off guard with its accuracy. We started having dinner every other Thursday, sometimes at his house in East Atlanta, where his wife Camille cooked with the serious joy of someone for whom feeding people is a form of love expressed at the highest level. Sometimes at restaurants around the city, working through Atlanta's endlessly expanding landscape of Black-owned dining establishments with the focused enthusiasm of two men who understood that spending money in the right places was itself a form of investment. Those dinners became the rhythm of my social week, the anchor point around which the rest of the season organized itself. Terrence talked about his patience with the careful anonymity of someone who understood privacy, but who also needed to process what he witnessed daily on the fragility of the human body, the way a heart can keep working through damage that would seem incompatible with continued function. I talked about the company, about the integration, about the foundation, about the morning runs and the apartment and the slow work of rebuilding a self that had been partially constructed around a partnership that no longer existed. Terrence listened the way good friends listen, which is to say he listened without trying to fix, and he responded without trying to redirect, and occasionally he said something so precisely true that I had to put my fork down and sit with it before I could continue the conversation. One Thursday in April, he said without preamble, in the middle of a conversation about something else entirely, "You know what I noticed about you during the marriage?" I said I didn't. He said, "You stopped finishing your sentences." I looked at him. He said, "You'd start a thought, and then you'd look at her and the thought would just stop, like you were editing yourself in real time based on her reaction before. You'd even finish the thought." He picked up his glass. "You don't do that anymore." I was quiet for a moment. And then I said, "I didn't know I was doing it." He said, "I know. That's the part that worried me." That conversation stayed with me for weeks. Because Terrence had named something I had felt but never articulated, not even in the interior monologue of those morning runs, not even in the twice-monthly sessions with Dr. Banks where I had become progressively more honest about progressively harder things, the editing, the real-time calibration of my own thoughts based on someone else's anticipated response. That is not the behavior of a man in a partnership. That is the behavior of a man who has learned somewhere along the way that full expression is not safe in the space he is occupying. And the insidious thing about that kind of learned behavior is that it happens so gradually and so quietly that you absorb it as your own preference rather than recognizing it as an adaptation to someone else's emotional climate. Dr. Banks, when I brought this to him, nodded with the expression of a man who had been waiting for me to arrive at this particular room. He said, "What do you think you were protecting?" I thought about it. I said, "The peace, the equilibrium. I was protecting the equilibrium of the household," he said. "And what did that cost you?" And I said slowly, finding the words as I went rather than delivering them from a prepared position, "It cost me the habit of knowing what I actually think. Because when you edit long enough, you stop being sure which thoughts are yours and which ones you suppressed before they could fully form." That was one of the most important things I said in that office. And Dr. Banks let it sit there without rushing to interpret it. Because the good therapists understand that some realizations need to be spoken and then given space before anything else is added to them. Spring moved into early summer, and the work continued on all fronts simultaneously, which is the nature of real life as opposed to the narratives we construct around it. In narratives, things happen sequentially. The personal crisis resolves, and then the professional. Triumph arrives, and then the healing begins, and then the new chapter opens. In real life, all of those things are happening at the same time, layered on top of each other, requiring you to be present in multiple registers at once and to have enough interior stability to hold all of them without any one of them collapsing the others. The Whitfield Garrett. Integration reached a critical milestone in May. The combined technology division, which had been named Cole Whitfield Digital, a naming decision that Marcus had insisted on, and that I had resisted on the grounds that the Whitfield name was doing more work in the marketplace than mine, before Marcus had reminded me with calm firmness that the brand value of the Cole name in the specific markets we were targeting was precisely the asset he had paid for, launched its first joint product offering to the market. A comprehensive logistics and supply chain management platform built on Cole Digital's foundational architecture but scaled by Whitfield Garrett's capital and distribution infrastructure to serve enterprise clients at a level that Cole Digital alone could never have accessed. The launch was covered by every major business publication that had covered the merger. The client response exceeded the projections that Renata had built, which were themselves aggressive. And Renata was not a woman who built aggressive projections without significant confidence in their achievability. I stood at the launch event, held at the Cole Whitfield offices in Midtown Atlanta, and I looked out at the room, at the 460 people whose professional futures were invested in what we had built together, at Priya in the third row with her tablet, and her characteristic expression of competent watchfulness, at Marcus Whitfield in the back of the room once again, at Gerald and Renata and Dr. Burrell and Yvette Chambers, who had come not because their legal work required it, but because they were the kind of people who show up for the moments that their earlier work made possible. And I felt something that I had not felt in a very long time. Not relief, not vindication. Something quieter and more durable than either of those. Something that I can only describe as rightness. The specific feeling of being exactly where the accumulated decisions of your life have been moving you toward and knowing it, and being able to stand in it fully rather than rushing through it toward the next thing. I gave a speech that evening that I had written myself at the kitchen table of the Inman Park apartment at 6 in the morning in the hour before my run. I had drafted it 3 times and thrown away the first 2 because they sounded like speeches rather than truth. The third draft sounded like truth because it was as simply and directly as I could manage to put it. I talked about where I started. I talked about the borrowed truck. I talked about my parents, and I saw my mother in the audience put her hand over her mouth, the way she does when she is holding emotion that she wants to release but is choosing to hold a little longer. I talked about the mission, not the financial mission, which had exceeded everything I had projected, but the human mission, the one that was about who got brought into the room and who got the contract and who got the mentorship and who got to see someone who looked like them standing at the front of the room and know that the front of the room was a place they could also occupy. And I talked about what I had learned in the past year about the difference between building something and being someone, and why the second task is harder than the first and why it matters more. When I finished, the room was quiet, for a moment in the way that rooms go quiet when something has landed, that they need a second to absorb. And then the applause began, and it was the kind that starts slowly and builds rather than the kind that erupts immediately. And the building kind has always felt more genuine to me because it means people are responding from something real rather than from the automatic social reflex of sound following a conclusion. Marcus came to find me afterward. He shook my hand with both of his, and he said simply, "Your parents did something extraordinary." I said, "They really did." And he said, "So did you." And he walked away before I could deflect it, which I think was deliberate. It was at that launch event, in the aftermath of the speech, while the room had loosened into conversation and the catering. Staff were moving through with champagne and the lighting had shifted to something warmer and more social, that I met Simone. She was standing near the window that faced Peachtree, talking with Priya, which was how I noticed her, because Priya does not give her conversational attention easily, and so the people she gives it to tend to be worth noticing. She was tall, natural hair cut close, wearing a deep green dress that made the warm light in the room work in her favor, though I suspected she would have worked in any light. She was laughing at something Priya had said, and the laugh was unguarded in the way that genuine laughter is unguarded, not performed for an audience, but released because something was actually funny. Priya caught my eye and gestured me over with the subtle efficiency of someone who has decided to be useful without making it obvious that she has decided to be useful. She introduced us. Simone Carter, a civil rights attorney based in Atlanta, who had been invited to the event by a mutual colleague because of her organization's work with Black-owned small businesses in the legal and regulatory space, work that intersected with the Cole Whitfield mission in ways that Priya had apparently already briefed her on. We shook hands and she said, "That was a remarkable speech." I said, "Thank you," and she said, with a directness that I immediately recognized as the hallmark of someone who says what they mean and has decided that life is too short for the alternative. The part about the borrowed truck, was that literally true? Or is that the kind of detail that gets added to a story over time to make it better? I laughed. Genuinely, the way Terrence made me laugh, caught off guard by accuracy. I said, "It was literally true. My cousin Marcus's truck. He wanted $20 a day for the use of it, and we negotiated down to 15 and a tank of gas," she said. "And did you pay him?" I said, "Every time. Raymond, Cole's son pays his debts." And she smiled at that. Not at the joke exactly, but at what was underneath it, which was a whole biography compressed into a single sentence. And she had heard the biography. That was the first thing I noticed about Simone Carter. She heard what was underneath the thing you said, not just the thing itself. We talked for 45 minutes. Not consecutively. The event moved around us, and we were both pulled away by other conversations and other obligations, but we kept finding our way back to the window, which I did not register consciously until the third time it happened, and I thought, this is not accidental. Neither of us was manufacturing the returns to the window. They were simply happening, with the naturalness of things that are actually being drawn together rather than things being pushed toward each other by social engineering. We talked about her work, which was genuinely fascinating. She had taken on 3 class action cases in the previous year on behalf of Black small business owners who had been systematically denied access to federal contracting opportunities, cases that were complex and underfunded and that she was pursuing with the tenacity of someone who had decided long ago that the right thing and the easy thing are almost never the same thing. We talked about Atlanta, which we both loved with the complicated affection of people who have grown up alongside a city and watched it become something larger and more expensive and in some ways less accessible to the people who built it. We talked about everything except the divorce, which she clearly knew about. Everyone in that room knew about it, but which she had the elegance to leave alone, neither referencing it as the dramatic backdrop to my current success nor pretending it didn't exist. When the event ended and the room began to empty, she gathered her coat and her bag and she said, "It was good to meet you, Darius Cole." I said it was good to meet her. And then, because I had spent a season learning that editing yourself in real time is a habit worth breaking, I said, "I'd like to continue this conversation. If you'd be open to it." She looked at me for a moment with the directness that I had already come to understand was simply how she moved through the world. And she said, "I'm open to it. I'm also honest about the fact that I'm a person with a full life who doesn't have patience for things that aren't real. So if continuing the conversation means something real, I'm interested. If it's something else, I'd rather we both spend that time on the work." I said, "I only know how to do real." And she said, "Then let's have dinner." I drove home to the Inman Park apartment that night and sat with the Kofi Mensa painting for a long time in the quiet, not analyzing, not planning, just sitting with the feeling of a day that had held in its single span of hours the full range of what a life in forward motion contains: the professional arrival, the personal opening, the gathering evidence that everything the storm had stripped away was being replaced, not restored. Replaced, because restoration implies returning to what was there before. And I had no interest in returning to what was there before. I wanted what came next. I wanted the version of my life that had been made possible by everything I had survived and learned and rebuilt and refused to be diminished by. I thought about what Dr. Banks had asked me. What would it cost you to need something? And I thought, sitting in that apartment on that night, maybe the cost is exactly what I paid. Maybe you have to lose the version of your life that was built on incomplete foundations before you can build the one that is built on real ones. Maybe the envelope on the marble island, slid across by a woman in the kitchen light with cold precision. Maybe that was not only the worst night of my life, maybe it was also, in some way that I was only now beginning to fully see, the night that everything necessary began. Not because suffering is redemptive in the simple, easy sense that stories sometimes offer, but because when the things that were false are removed, what remains is only what is true, and what is true when you are finally standing in it without the weight of what was false pressing down on it, turns out to be more than enough. It turns out to be, if you are willing to do the work of seeing it clearly, the foundation you always deserve to be building on. The dinner with Simone was Thursday of the following week. Terrence called me Wednesday evening. Somehow, through the professional network that Atlanta runs on, he had already heard that I had met someone at the launch event. He said, "Wait, Simone Carter?" I said, "How do you know that?" He said, "Darius, I know everything." "Is it real?" I thought about her standing at the window in the green dress, hearing the biography underneath the sentence. I said, "It might be." He said, "Good. You've been building long enough. Build something that includes you this time." I held that. The way I had held everything else this season had asked me to hold, carefully with both hands, without gripping so hard that I crushed what I was carrying or holding so loosely that I lost it. The way my mother had taught me to hold the things that mattered, not through instruction, but through example, through the way she had moved, through every difficulty of her own life with a combination of grip and grace that I had been absorbing. Since before I had language to name what I was watching, build something that includes you this time. I intended to. There is a difference between being ready and being prepared, and most people use the two words as though they mean the same thing, but they do not. And the difference between them matters enormously when you are standing at the edge of something new. Being prepared means you have done the work. You have read the materials, built the skills, thought through the scenarios, assembled the resources. Preparation is intellectual and logistical, and it is the part that I have always been good at. Because preparation responds to effort, and effort is something I have never been short of. Being ready is different. Being ready is not about what you have done. It is about what you have become. It is about whether the interior landscape of you, the beliefs you carry about yourself, the patterns you have built around vulnerability and trust and need, the stories you tell yourself about what you deserve, and what is possible for you has been sufficiently rebuilt after whatever dismantled it to support the weight of what you are about to walk into. Preparation you can schedule. Readiness arrives on its own timeline, and it cannot be rushed without consequences, and the only honest way to assess it is to look at yourself without flattery and ask whether you are actually standing on solid ground or whether you are standing on the hope of solid ground, which looks the same from the outside but behaves very differently under pressure. I had spent the spring asking that question, honestly, repeatedly, without the kind of self-congratulatory narrative that makes it easy to tell yourself you have healed when what you have actually done is become skilled at the performance of healing. Dr. Banks had helped me develop the ability to tell the difference, not through dramatic breakthroughs. The therapy that actually works rarely produces dramatic breakthroughs. Despite what the stories suggest, it produces something quieter and more durable, a gradually increasing accuracy of self-perception, the ability to look at your own motivations and your own patterns without either brutal self-condemnation or protective self-justification, just to see them clearly, and decide from that place of clear seeing what you want to do next. What I saw when I looked clearly was that I was not fully healed. 7 years of marriage, even a marriage that had been built partly on false premises, leaves a residue, the habits of compromise that become habits of self-suppression, the instincts for reading a room that develop when you have spent years trying to manage the emotional temperature of a shared space, the protective distance that you learn to maintain when closeness has proven to have a cost that arrived without warning. Those things do not dissolve because you have moved to a new apartment and started running in the mornings and made peace with the legal outcome and had productive conversations with a good therapist. They thin, yes. They lose their grip incrementally with effort and time. But they are present, and I knew they were present. And I had decided that knowing they were present was not a reason to delay living. It was a reason to live with honesty about them, to bring them into whatever came next, not as secrets, but as known quantities that I had committed to continuing to address. That was what readiness looked like for me in that season. Not the absence of residue, the honest acknowledgement of it, and the commitment to not letting it make decisions on my behalf. Dinner with Simone was a Thursday evening in early June at a restaurant in the old Fourth Ward that had opened the previous year and that had become, in the quiet consensus of Atlanta's black professional community, the kind of place you went when the occasion warranted something more than ordinary. Not a showy restaurant. The design was warm and unaffected, good lighting, acoustics that allowed actual conversation. A menu built around Southern ingredients, elevated by technique without losing the honesty that Southern food requires to be itself. I arrived 7 minutes early, which is my default, and sat at the bar with a glass of water and let myself be present in the room before she arrived. She arrived 2 minutes before the reservation, which told me something about her relationship with time and, therefore, with other people's time, which is always more revealing than it appears. She was wearing a burnt orange dress and small gold earrings, and she moved through the restaurant with the ease of someone who is comfortable in their own body and in public space, not performing ease but actually possessing it. She spotted me at the bar and lifted 2 fingers in a small wave that was economical and warm at the same time, and I found myself smiling before I had decided to. We were seated and we ordered, and then we talked for 3 hours with the quality of conversation that you forget is rare until you are inside it and realize how long it has been since you experienced it. She was not performing. Neither was I. That was the thing I noticed most acutely, with the particular sensitivity of someone who had spent years in the proximity of a very skilled performer. The absence of performance. Simone Carter said what she thought. She disagreed with me twice in the first hour, directly and without apology, which I found more appealing than I had words for in the moment. Because a person who will disagree with you directly is a person you can actually trust, because you know that when they agree, they actually agree. She asked questions that went beneath the surface of what I was saying to the thinking underneath it, which required me to access thinking I hadn't necessarily intended to share, and which I found myself sharing anyway, because her attention had a quality that made withholding feel like bad faith. She told me about her work with the precision and passion of someone who has chosen their purpose deliberately rather than stumbled into it. She had grown up in Birmingham, Alabama, the daughter of a Baptist minister and a high school principal, which explained, she said with a dry humor that I immediately recognized as the sophisticated kind, both her commitment to justice and her inability to tolerate noise that wasn't in service of something real. She had gone to Spelman for undergrad, Howard for law school, clerked for a federal judge in Washington for 2 years, and then done something that her law school peers had found either admirable or inexplicable depending on their relationship with financial ambition. She had turned down offers from 3 major firms and come back to Atlanta to open a small practice focused exclusively on civil rights and small business, equity litigation. She had been doing it for 9 years. She had won some significant victories and suffered some significant losses and had developed, through the combination of those experiences, the kind of professional equanimity that comes not from being unaffected by outcomes, but from being deeply grounded in purpose regardless of them. I asked her at some point in the second hour what the hardest part of the work was. She was quiet for a moment in a way that told me she was accessing a real answer rather than a ready one. And then she said, "The hardest part is watching people accept less than what the law actually says. They're entitled to because they've been told so many times by so many systems that they don't deserve the full amount that they've started to believe it. I spend half my time doing the legal work and the other half just reminding people that their full measure is real and it is theirs, and no institution gets to decide otherwise." She paused. "That part isn't in any law school course. They don't teach you that. The real advocacy sometimes happens before you ever file anything." I thought about that for a long time, even while we continued talking, because what she had described, the work of reminding people that their full measure is real, was something that resonated in a way that went beyond the professional. It resonated in the personal space, in the space where I had spent a season learning to distinguish between the things I had accepted because they were genuinely mine and the things I had accepted, because enough time in a certain kind of relationship had made me believe that accepting less was the price of maintaining peace. We ordered dessert, which neither of us needed and both of us wanted, and while we were waiting for it, she said, with the directness that I had already come to understand was simply how she was built, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that you don't have to answer it if you don't want to, but I'm going to ask because I think it matters, and I don't see the point of dancing around things that matter." I said, "Ask." She said, "What did the marriage teach you?" "Not about her, about yourself." And I looked at her across the table, and I understood that this was the question, underneath all the other questions, the one that cut to the actual center of what the past year had been about. And I thought about what Dr. Banks had asked and what my mother had said, and what Terrence had named at dinner about the half-finished sentences. And I said, it taught me that I had confused being strong with being complete, that I had built a company and a reputation and a mission and a very convincing external life, and I thought that adding a marriage to that structure meant I was building something whole, but what I had actually built was an impressive exterior around an interior that still had significant rooms I hadn't finished, and the marriage didn't finish them. I finished them, started finishing them, only after it ended. She was quiet, listening. I said, "I also learned that the editing you do of yourself in the presence of someone who doesn't make it safe to be unedited becomes invisible after a while. You stop knowing you're doing it. You think you're just being considerate, being measured, being the person in the room who doesn't take up too much space. But what you're actually doing is disappearing in increments, and by the time you notice, you've lost the habit of showing up fully. I stopped. She was looking at me with an expression I had not yet learned to read, and then she said, "That was a real answer." I said, "You asked a real question." The dessert arrived, and we ate it, and the conversation shifted and lightened, and we talked about things that were less weighty but equally genuine. Atlanta food, a documentary we had both recently watched, her impossible cat named Thurgood, who had opinions about her work schedule, my morning runs, and the particular meditative quality of Inman Park before the city woke up. We stayed until the restaurant had nearly emptied, and then we walked outside into the warm Atlanta night and stood on the sidewalk in the June air that smelled like magnolia and car exhaust and the particular urban summer perfume that I had been breathing since childhood, and that still, after everything, meant home. She said she had a good evening. I said I did too, and I meant it in a way that I felt in my chest rather than just in the social register of the phrase. I said I would like to do it again. She said she would like that too. She called a car, and while we were waiting, she said, "Can I tell you something?" I said yes. She said, "I looked you up before tonight, not because I didn't already know who you are, but because I wanted to know what the story looked like from the outside before I got inside it. And the story from the outside is very impressive, and I was appropriately impressed. And then I set that aside and spent this evening looking at who you actually are. And who you actually are is considerably more interesting than the story from the outside." She paused. "I just wanted you to know that I'm interested in the second thing. Not the first." Her car arrived. She got in. She sent a single text message 40 minutes later, when she was presumably home. That said, Thursday was good. Thurgood disagrees, because I was late feeding him, but Thurgood is difficult, and I've made my peace with that. I put the phone down and smiled at the ceiling of the Inman Park apartment. And the Kofi Mensa painting looked different in that moment than it had ever looked before, warmer in the blue tones, and I understood that was just my own feeling recoloring the world, and I let it. But the world was not finished, recoloring itself in other ways that had nothing to do with Simone, and some of those recolorings were less warm. In July, 3 months after the settlement had been signed and the legal chapter had been formally closed, I received information that required me to make a decision about who I was going to be in a situation that had no obvious right answer, and that would test whether the clarity I believed I had achieved was real or whether it was the kind of clarity that only holds when things are going well and reveals its limitations, the moment the conditions become genuinely difficult. Gerald called me on a Tuesday afternoon and said, "I need to talk to you about something that has come to my attention through a source I trust. It doesn't affect you legally. The settlement is done and it is final, and there is no legal dimension to what I'm about to tell you. But I think you should know." I said, "Tell me." He said, "Vanessa is in serious financial difficulty." He laid out what he knew. The settlement she had received, while not the number she had originally sought, was not insubstantial, but Celestine Park's fees had been considerable, because Celestine Park did not do discounted work under any circumstances, and the case had run longer and required more resources than Vanessa had initially budgeted for. The apartment she had moved into was in a building whose monthly costs were set against an income expectation that had since contracted because the professional situation at the firm had continued to deteriorate in the months since December. There had been a restructuring in her division, whether directly related to anything in her personal life or simply the collateral timing of a corporate decision that had been building for reasons independent of her circumstances. Gerald did not know, and neither did I, and her position had been reclassified in a way that affected both her title and her compensation. Marcus Bellamy had not been in contact with her since November. The parallel life she had maintained during the marriage was not, it turned out, a relationship he had any intention of formalizing. He had his own life, his own calculations, his own capacity for maintaining a convenient distance when convenience required it. He had retreated as smoothly and as quietly as he had appeared in her life, leaving nothing behind except the documented record that Gerald's investigators had found. She was not destitute. I want to be precise about that. because precision matters when you are talking about another person's circumstances. But she was in a position that was significantly more precarious than anything she had imagined when she prepared that envelope 3 months before handing it to me, when she had presumably been calculating a future that included a very different financial floor than the one she was now standing on. Gerald, having laid all of this out, said, "I'm not telling you this because I think you have any obligation. I'm telling you because you would want to know, and because the decision about what to do with this information is yours to make, and I think you should make it from full information rather than partial information." I thanked him, and then I sat in the quiet of my office for a long time, looking out at the Atlanta skyline, turning the information over in my hands the way you turn something heavy and complicated when you are trying to find its actual weight. I thought about what my mother had said at the kitchen table in West End, about strength being confused for a surface people stand on. I thought about what Dr. Banks had asked. What would it cost you to need something? I turned both of those over alongside the new information, looking for the intersection, looking for the answer that came from genuine principle, rather than from performance of principle, because those are not the same thing and the distinction matters more than almost anything else. What I knew was this: Vanessa had done me a significant harm. She had extracted money from our marriage covertly over 4 years. She had conducted a parallel relationship for 22 months while I was building something that I believed was for us. She had chosen the worst possible night to begin the formal end of the marriage, with the timing precision of a strategist rather than the honesty of a person. Those things were true, and they remained true regardless of what had happened to her since. What I also knew was this: she was a human being. She was a woman with genuine talent who had made consequential mistakes and was now living in the geography of their results without the parallel life she had constructed, without the professional position she had occupied, without the financial floor she had assumed would be there. And I was a man whose mother had pressed his school shirts on Sunday evenings with a care that was a form of prayer, who had been raised to understand that what you do for people who are not in a position to do anything for you in return is the truest measure of who you are, not the deals, not the valuations, not the headlines in the Atlanta Business Chronicle. What you do when there is nothing in it for you and the person you're doing it for is the last person anyone would expect you to extend yourself toward. I did not call Vanessa. I did not contact her directly. That would have been the wrong kind of intervention, too personal, too loaded with everything that had passed between us, too likely to be received as something other than what it was. What I did instead was make a phone call to the managing director of her firm, a man named Harold Price, whom I knew professionally and who had always conducted himself with the straightforwardness that I respected in professional relationships. I told Harold that I was calling on a matter unrelated to any personal circumstances, but that I wanted to understand whether his firm had capacity for a specific kind of work, brand, strategy consulting for the Cole Whitfield Digital Community Engagement Initiative, which was a real initiative that Priya and I had been discussing for weeks and that genuinely required exactly the kind of expertise that Vanessa's firm, and Vanessa specifically, possessed. Harold was a sophisticated enough professional to understand what I was doing without requiring me to explain it. He was also a decent enough human being to receive it in the spirit in which it was offered rather than making it complicated. He said he would look into the firm's capacity and get back to me. 2 weeks later, Gerald confirmed, through his own channels, that Vanessa had been assigned as the lead strategist on the Cole Whitfield community engagement account. The account was significant enough to affect her professional standing. The work was real, which meant her contribution to it would be real, which meant whatever she recovered would be recovered on the basis of her actual ability rather than on the basis of anything that came from me directly. I told no one what I had done. Not Gerald, not Priya, not Terrence, not Dr. Banks, not my parents, not Simone, who I had now seen 4 more times since the Thursday dinner, and with whom something genuine was building with the careful and honest pace that genuine things require. I told no one because telling someone would have turned it into a statement about who I was, and it was not a statement. It was simply a decision made from the principles my parents had given me and the clarity the past year had produced. In a situation that had no witnesses except myself and whatever version of integrity I had decided to live by. The world did not need to know. I needed to know, and I did. What came next was not the end of the story, but it was the moment when the story became something I could look at fully. All of it. The storm and the season and the building and the deciding, and recognize as mine. Not the story I would have written, not the story I had expected, but the true one, the one that had been shaped by everything real that had happened, and that was therefore the only story capable of leading anywhere real. That is the only kind of story worth telling, and it was not yet finished. There is a moment that arrives, if you are fortunate, and if you have done the work, and if you have been honest with yourself. Through the hardest parts of the doing, when the life you are living stops feeling like a reconstruction and starts feeling like a foundation. Not the foundation you lost, not the restored version of what existed before the storm came. Through and revealed which parts of the structure were genuine and which parts had been held up by the equivalent of good, lighting and strategic arrangement. A new foundation, one that has been built from what the storm left behind. After it took everything that wasn't load-bearing, which turns out in the aftermath to be a better building, material than anything you would have chosen for yourself before you understood what load-bearing actually means. That moment arrived for me on a Sunday in September, 14 months after Vanessa had slid that envelope across the kitchen island, and it arrived not with drama or announcement, but with the quiet certainty of something that has been true for a while finally, making itself visible in a way you can no longer overlook. I was sitting on the east-facing terrace of the Inman Park apartment. In the early morning, before the run, before the phone calls, before the day assembled itself into the structure of demands and decisions and forward motion that constituted my professional life. The Atlanta skyline was catching the first light in the way it catches it in September. When the summer heat has begun, its slow retreat and the air has that quality of something about to change, not yet changed, but tilting toward it, the way a season does in the days before it fully commits to becoming the next one. I had a cup of coffee. I had the morning quiet. And I had, for the first time in as long as I could accurately remember, absolutely nothing pressing against the interior of the moment. No legal urgency, no unresolved grief, no anger that needed metabolizing, no unfinished reckoning requiring my attention. Just the morning, and the city, and the coffee, and the particular feeling of being entirely present in a life that was, despite everything it had cost to arrive here, genuinely good. I thought about the 14 months in the way that you think about a period of time when you are finally far enough from it to see its shape rather than just its contents. I thought about the night of the envelope and the morning of the signing and the months of legal maneuvering and the West End kitchen table and the Inman Park apartment and the morning runs and the Thursday dinners with Terrence and the sessions with Dr. Banks and the launch event and the first dinner with Simone and the phone call to Harold Price and everything in between and after and underneath all of it. And what I saw, looking at the shape of those 14 months from the September terrace, was not a story of triumph over adversity, which is the version that the outside world tends to prefer because it has a clean emotional arc and a satisfying landing. What I saw was something more complicated and more true. I saw a story about a man who had built extraordinary things and missed something fundamental in the building, who had been genuinely wronged and had also been genuinely unavailable in ways that mattered, who had been strong in the ways that strength is visible and insufficient in the ways that strength cannot substitute for, and who had used the devastation not as a launching pad for vindication but as an excavation, digging down through the layers until he found the ground that was actually solid, and then building from there. That is the story I want to tell truthfully. Not the version where everything Vanessa did was monstrous and everything I did was blameless, because that version is a fiction, and I have no patience for useful fictions when the true version is available and is, in its complexity, actually more valuable. Not the version where suffering is redemptive, in the simple transactional sense, where you put enough pain in and get enough wisdom out and the math balances neatly. But the version where a man looks at what happened to him and what he contributed, to what happened to him and what he built from the ruins of what happened to him, and decides that the full account, held honestly, is the only account worth giving. Simone arrived at 9 that morning. She had a key, which she had been given 6 weeks earlier, in a moment that I had not made ceremonial, because neither of us needed the ceremony, and we both understood what it meant, and we both understood that what it meant was real, and that the reality of it was sufficient without the performance of additional significance. She came through the door in running clothes, her own morning run already completed, carrying a paper bag from the bakery 2 blocks down that she had adopted as her contribution to Sunday mornings, which had become ours in the way that things become ours when 2 people with full, separate, carefully constructed lives decide to allow genuine overlap. She set the bag on the kitchen counter and came to the terrace and sat in the chair beside mine and looked at the skyline in the morning light and said, "Nothing for a while," which was one of the things about her that I had come to understand as a specific and rare form of respect. She knew that the morning quiet was not empty. She knew it was where I did something important, and she sat beside it without filling it. After a while, she said, "You look different this morning." I said, "Different how?" She said, "Settled. Like something landed." I said, "Something did." She waited. I said, "I think I've been waiting to feel like I'm actually here. Like the last year wasn't a crisis. I was navigating my way through, but a life I was actually living. And this morning, sitting here before you got here, I felt it. I'm actually here." She looked at me with the directness that was simply how she was made. And she said, "You've been here for a while. You just had to catch up to it." And I thought about that, and I thought she was probably right. And I thought that one of the specific gifts of being with someone who sees clearly is that they can sometimes show you what you are, standing in before you have learned to see it yourself. We ate the pastries from the bag and drank coffee and talked about the week ahead, which for both of us was substantial. She had a hearing on Tuesday in one of her class action cases that had reached a critical procedural moment, and I had a board meeting for the Cole Whitfield digital combined entity that would include Marcus Whitfield and the full executive leadership team, and a strategic planning session that would set the direction of the company for the following 3 years. We talked about her case with the seriousness it deserved. She had been working it for 11 months, and the hearing represented the first moment at which the legal theory she had constructed would be tested against a federal judge's scrutiny, and the stakes were real, and she was prepared, and she was also underneath the preparation, carrying the weight of what it meant for the 47 small business owners whose claims were built into the case. I listened with the full attention I had learned over months with Simone to give, rather than the divided attention I had defaulted to during years of having my best focus perpetually allocated elsewhere. She noticed the difference. She had told me so once, not as a compliment but as an observation, the way she offered most things factually, without flattery, which meant that when she said something appreciative, it carried the full weight of being genuinely meant. After breakfast, I ran 4 miles through Inman Park and Candler Park in the September air that smelled of the season turning, and I ran with the specific lightness of a man who has nothing to outrun, which is the best way to run. The way running is supposed to feel when it is a practice of presence rather than a practice of escape. I thought about the board meeting and the strategic plan and what I wanted the next 3 years of Cole Whitfield to look like and what I wanted the next 3 years of my own life to look like. And for the first time in as long as I could remember, those 2 questions were not in competition with each other. The company's forward motion and my own forward motion were not pulling in different directions. They were aligned because I had spent the past 14 months building an interior life that was congruent with the external one, and congruence, I had discovered, is the foundation that makes everything else sustainable. The board meeting on Wednesday was the most significant one since the merger. Marcus Whitfield ran it with the measured authority of someone who has been in enough rooms to know when to speak and when to let the room speak, and the room was full of people who had earned their seats at the table through the kind of work that is not reducible to credentials or connections, but that shows up in the quality of what they build and the integrity of how they build it. I presented the 3-year strategic vision with the clarity that comes from having thought about it not just in the technical sense, but in the value sense from having asked not only what the company could achieve, but what the company was for and whether the achieving of it would be true to that purpose. The room received it with the engagement of people who recognized something real. Afterward, Marcus found me in the hallway in the way he always found me, quietly, without fanfare, pulling me slightly to the side of the main traffic of departing executives with the ease of someone who has been navigating rooms for 6 decades. He said, "I want to tell you something that I should have said months ago." I waited. He said, "When we were doing our due diligence on Cold Digital, 2 years before we made the approach, my team flagged the personal situation, your marriage, the signs that something was structurally unstable in your personal life. Some of my advisors recommended we wait. They said personal instability creates professional risk." He paused. I overruled them. I said the personal situation was not our business, and that what I had seen of Darius Cole suggested he was not a man whose professional character was contingent on his personal circumstances being favorable. He looked at me. I was right, but I wanted you to know that I knew, and that the knowing didn't change anything. Because you are exactly the man I understood you to be before I understood what you were walking through. He shook my hand, both hands, the way he did when he meant something fully. Now go build the next thing. I drove to the West End Foundation offices that afternoon. Not for any scheduled event. The next formal event was 3 months away. But I had gotten into the habit of stopping by when I was in the neighborhood, which I manufactured reasons to be in with enough frequency that Priya had noticed and had stopped, questioning it. The office was a converted storefront on a block that had been quietly transforming over the past 2 years, not with the aggressive gentrification that had displaced so many black communities in Atlanta, but with the more deliberate kind of development that happens when the people who are from a place decide to invest in it on their own terms. 3 of the businesses on that block were owned by graduates of the Foundation's first cohort. One of them, a young woman named Destiny Ware, 24 years old, who had grown up 4 streets over from my childhood home and who had built a digital marketing agency with 3 employees in the 18 months since completing the foundation program, had landed her first corporate client the previous month, a client whose name I recognized because it was one of Cole Whitfield's vendor partners, a connection that had happened not because I had engineered it, but because Destiny's work was good enough to speak for itself in the rooms it had been introduced to. I sat with Destiny for an hour in her office, which was small and meticulously organized, and covered in the evidence of someone who was building something real and knew it and was treating the building accordingly. She showed me her client work. She talked about what she was learning and what she was still figuring out and where she felt uncertain and where she felt strong. She did not perform confidence she didn't have, and she did not perform doubt she didn't feel. And I recognized in her the quality that I had tried to model at the foundation event in February, the willingness to be accurate rather than impressive, which is the foundation of any real professional development. I told her what I saw in the work, honestly, including the places where she could push further, and the places where she was already doing something distinctive. She listened the way people listen when they are, actually using what they hear rather than just receiving it. When I stood to leave, she said, "Can I ask you something?" I said yes. She said, "Do you ever miss when it was simpler? Like when you were starting out and the stakes were smaller and it was just you and the idea?" I thought about it. I thought about the borrowed truck and the Buckhead lawns and the code boot camp, and the first version of ClearPath that barely worked, and the $40 million federal contract I had walked away from, and the night of the envelope and the morning of the signing and the September terrace, and Simone at the door with the bakery bag. And I said, no, I don't miss it. The simpler stages were necessary, but they weren't better. They were the preparation. This is the thing the preparation was for. She nodded slowly, absorbing that. And then she said, "I want to get here." I said, "You're already on your way. The only question is whether you're willing to go through whatever the road requires." She said, "I am." I said, "I know. That's why you're going to." I drove home through the West End as the afternoon light was moving toward evening, through the streets I had run as a child and ridden a bicycle down as a teenager, and driven away from as a young man with a borrowed truck, and a relentless idea, and that I had been driving back to with increasing regularity as the man I had become. Not because you can go back. You cannot go back. The backward door is the one kind of door that does not exist. But because where you come from is not behind you, it is underneath you. It is the ground your feet are standing on every time you walk into any room. And the further you walk, the more important it is to know what that ground is made of. Gerald called as I was pulling into the Inman Park garage. He said, "Something you should know. Vanessa has been promoted. Within the firm." The Cole Whitfield account apparently demonstrated some things about her capabilities that had gotten obscured in the previous years. "Circumstances," I said. "That's good." He said, "It is. I thought you'd want to know." I said, "I did want to know." He said, "I also want to say something I don't say often enough, which is that the way you handled this entire situation, all of it, from the night she handed you the papers to everything since, was the most dignified thing I've watched a client do in 30 years of practice. And I've watched a lot of clients." I was quiet for a moment. And then I said, "I had good people around me, Gerald." He said, "You did. But you had to be the kind of person who could use what good people offered. Not everyone can do that." I thanked him. He said goodnight. I sat in the garage for a minute in the quiet. Simone was inside the apartment when I came up. She was at the kitchen table with her case files. Thurgood apparently having been left in the custody of a neighbor for the night, her reading glasses on and her attention entirely on the documents in front of her in the way that I had come to find one of the most appealing things about her, the completeness of her focus, the way she gave herself entirely to what was in front of her and trusted that everything else could wait its turn. She looked up when I came in and said, "How was the West End?" I said, "Good, really good." She said, "The foundation girl?" I said, "Destiny, yes." She said, "Good kid?" I said, "Extraordinary kid. She's going to build something real." Simone smiled and went back to her files, and I stood in the kitchen of the Inman Park apartment and looked at the Kofi Mensa painting and at the woman at the kitchen table and at the light coming through the east-facing windows, amber in the evening rather than gold in the morning, and felt the full weight of the life I was standing inside. Not the life I had planned. Not the life I would have designed from the beginning if designing had been available as an option. The life that had been built from everything real, the relentlessness my parents gave me and the principles I had refused to compromise and the devastation I had survived and the clarity it had produced, and the people who had held steady, and the man I had become in the rebuilding of everything the storm had shown me was not solid. That life, this one. A year after the settlement, I established an endowed scholarship in my mother's name at the high school I had attended in the West, and the Gloria Cole Scholarship, awarded annually to a graduating senior who demonstrated, in the committee's assessment, not the highest grades or the most conventional markers of academic achievement, but the quality that the application simply described as relentlessness in the service of something real. My mother sat in the front row of the announcement ceremony in the school auditorium, and she did not cry, which surprised me. And afterward I asked her why, and she said, "Because I'm not sad, baby. Sad people cry. I'm just full." My father stood beside her with his hand on her shoulder and said nothing, which was everything. 3 months later, on a Saturday evening in October, I asked Simone to marry me, not in a grand setting, not with the kind of production that my financial position would have made entirely possible. At the Inman Park apartment, on the east-facing terrace, in the October air that had finally committed to being autumn, with the city laid out beneath us in the blue hour between daylight and dark. I had not rehearsed a speech. I had thought about what I wanted to say, and I had decided that what I wanted to say was simple, and that simple, in this case, was not inadequate but exact. I said, "I spent a lot of years building things, and I built some remarkable things, and I'm proud of them, and they are genuinely mine. But the most important thing I've built in the last 2 years is the version of myself that is honest enough and present, enough and whole enough to be a real partner to someone. And I want to be that to you. Not the impressive version, the real one, for as long as you'll have it." She looked at me for a long moment, in the way she looked at things when she was accessing her actual response rather than the available one. And then she said, "The real one is the only version I was ever interested in, yes." Thurgood, who had been brought to the apartment for the occasion and who had an opinion about everything, knocked a glass off the kitchen counter at approximately that moment, which was his contribution to the proceedings. I did not post about the engagement on any platform. I did not issue a statement. I told my parents on Sunday morning in the West End kitchen, and my mother said, "I knew from the moment you told me about her that she was the kind of woman who would tell you the truth," which was the highest possible compliment from a woman who had built her entire life on the truth. I told Terrence over Thursday dinner, and he put his fork down and stood up and hugged me across the restaurant table in a way that drew attention from other diners and did not care even slightly, which was the most Terrence thing possible and which I accepted with the full gratitude of a man who knows what it means to have a friend who has been watching for your good and cheering for it with his whole chest for 20 years. Gerald heard through the professional network because Gerald hears everything, and sent a handwritten note on his firm's letterhead that said simply, "Well done." All of it. What I know now, standing on the other side of everything this story contains, is something that I could not have learned any way except the way I learned it, which is to say by living through it without shortcuts and without the consolation of a clean narrative that made it easier than it was. I know that what you build is only as real as what you build it from. I know that relentlessness is not enough by itself. It must be paired with honesty, with vulnerability, with the willingness to be seen in the incomplete places and to keep building from them rather than hiding them. Behind the finished rooms, I know that the people who love you correctly, your mother pressing your shirts on a Sunday evening, your father holding your hand 1 second longer at the altar, your friend who notices when you stop, finishing your sentences. Those people are not peripheral to what you are building. They are the reason the building has a point. I know that devastation is not the end of anything except the things that needed to end. I know that the woman who handed me those papers across the cold marble island, in the kitchen of a house we had stopped actually inhabiting, together long before that night, did me a harm that was real and consequential, and that I do not minimize. And I know that the same night that harm arrived, something else arrived with it. The door to the only life I was ever actually going to be able to fully live. I did not see it that night. On that night, I sat on the edge of the bed in the dark and held myself, together by the thread of everything my parents had made me from. But it was there. It is always there in the worst nights. The door that the worst nights open, if you are willing to walk through it, instead of spending the rest of your life in the hallway, bargaining with the darkness about why you should get to go back to the room you came from. I walked through it. And what was on the other side of it was this, exactly this. The September terrace and the morning light and the woman at the kitchen table and the painting. That looks different every time, and the boy from the West End who built something extraordinary and then built something truer. The scholarship in his mother's name, the foundation on the block where he grew up, the company that carries the mission he refused to compromise, the friend who hugs him across restaurant tables, the father who holds his hand 1 second longer and says everything without a word, the mother who is not sad, who is full. All of it, every single last piece of it, his. If you have made it to the end of this story, then you already know that what you just witnessed was never really about a divorce or a billion-dollar deal or a woman who miscalculated the man she was walking away from. What you witnessed was something far more important than any of that. You witnessed what happens when a person refuses to let the worst night of their life become the final word about who they are. Darius Cole did not win because he was richer or smarter or more legally prepared than the people who came against him. He won because he never confused what he was building with who he was. He never let the stripping away of what was false convince him that everything was lost. He understood at the deepest level that devastation is not the end of your story. It is the excavation of it. It is the moment when everything that was never truly yours falls away, and what remains, standing in the rubble, is the only version of you that was ever going to build something that lasts. There are lessons in this story that have nothing to do with money and everything to do with life. Know the difference between being prepared and being ready. Build your professional life with relentlessness, but build your interior life with the same ferocity, because the interior is the foundation that everything else is standing on. And if that foundation has rooms you have never finished, eventually the structure will tell you. Surround yourself with people who tell you the truth, who notice when you stop finishing your sentences, who show up to your worst seasons, without being asked and without needing the credit for showing up. And when the worst night arrives, because it arrives for all of us, do not make permanent decisions from inside it. Breathe. Call the person you trust. Hold yourself together by whatever thread is available. And in the morning, put on your best suit and go sign your name to everything you have earned. The world will respond to who you actually are far more honestly than it will respond to who you are pretending to be. Let it see the real thing. And to everyone watching this channel, everyone who has given their time and their attention to this story, and to every story we have told on this platform, I need you to hear this clearly. Your time is the most valuable thing you have, and the fact that you spend any of it here means we owe you something worthy of it every single time. We do not take that lightly, not for one episode, not for one word. So if this story moved you, if it made you feel something real, if you found yourself holding your breath at the hard parts and exhaling at the ones that landed the way truth lands, then please subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that notification bell so that when the next story drops, you are the first person in the room. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, someone who is in their own worst night right now and who needs to know that the morning comes and that what you build in the aftermath of the hardest thing can be more solid than anything that came before it. Because what is coming next on this channel is going to be unlike anything we have released before. The next story we are dropping is the kind of story that stops you mid-sentence, the kind that makes you put your phone down and pick it back up, because you cannot decide whether to walk away from it or surrender to it completely. It is a story about secrets kept across decades, about the moment when the truth arrives in a form nobody was ready for, and about what one decision made in a single moment of fear can do to every generation that follows it. It is going to be emotional in ways this story was emotional, and then it is going to go further into territory that will sit with you long after the final word. We are building something on this channel that is real. Story by story, word by word, we are building something that matters. And you are not just a viewer. You are the reason we tell these stories the way we tell them, with every word accountable, every sentence earning its place, every story worthy of the life it is representing. Stay with us. The best is not behind us. It is exactly what comes next.